Roger was somebody who worked alone and sitting still for many hours, waiting for the sun to be in the right place. But walking for him was the start of that whole process, or so it seemed to me. And he was always looking for wood. He was always out there looking for something that he might be able to use to work on. And he often found wood that was discarded later on. But I think the place that wood was found somehow left its spirit within the piece of wood that he then worked on. And although they appeared to be quite separate activities, his sitting quietly holding a piece of wood in his hand and burning with his magnifying glass was perhaps a kind of meditation, a way of getting back to that place where he perhaps first found the wood, as well as being in the present, listening to the birdsong around him, watchful of what the sun was doing, mindful of the fact that he might be sitting in his own garden, or if he was abroad, sitting in a quiet place that he'd chosen out of the way of people. He was somebody who was a very social person and engaging when he was in company, but he had a solitary side, like most artists do, that's profoundly important, the need to be alone.
This was the second summer where he invited me to spend time on the Isle of Wight. And the Isle of Wight is a bright, sunny place. And so we used to work early in the morning, serving breakfast, cleaning up, everything, get things ready to get the tables ready for the midday meal. And then we'd have a couple of hours before lunch started. So we'd sit in the sun, or we'd go for a swim, and or we'd do some work. And so one day he had these things, and he had his magnifying glass, and he just started to burn a piece of wood on the lawn in front of the hotel. And that was the very, very first time I saw him do it. It was quite early. I can't say it was 71 or 72, but that's the first time he did it, I think.
I think the only thing I would say that we maybe haven't emphasised particularly is that apart from all of those things we've talked about, I would say walking and what happens to two people when they're walking, and walking for quite a long while, the understanding you can develop through that and doing it with each other quite often, and the things you end up talking about and the depth to which you talk about them, I'd say that was a really fundamental, it was always, well, where shall we walk to? What walk shall we go on today? We never ever thought about sitting around at Coast Guards for very long. It was always a walk. And I think, that slightly fed over into making the work I've got upstairs at Blakeney, in that I first walked there with Roger, but also the whole process I've kind of adopted. It's not part of the work, it's really logistics, but I didn't want to sit in a car to get there. I wanted to arrive there through physical activity of my own, in the same way that Roger and I used to arrive there on foot, having walked from Webburn. That process and the things you can get out of walking. Roger made me really aware of them, but I really enjoyed them with him. So it was really special.
Yes, we talk quite a lot about our work. He was very interested in simple, pragmatic rituals and the spiritual dimension of those rituals. He was very interested in repetition, doing something over and over again, both in his work and in his way of life, walking the same path, sweeping with the same broom, as much as making a line on a piece of wood and repeating that line in a piece of work, sometimes hundreds of times.
His work becomes a diary of a place, of a time, of a circumstance, of a weather, of whatever. It becomes an almanac of his life. And so it becomes something very private, in a way, and for him.
Well, the line is the transformative aspect. So you have a piece of wood which has its history, and now it's being rationalized, I suppose. It's being observed, closely observed by a lens, with the sun. And this wonderful repetition of just keeping it that. So wherever it is applied, the same action, applied, every object's going to be different, will produce a different result, but there has to be something consistent to be able to magnify all the other aspects of the wood. Yeah, I remember Rogers with the pins and the things. I was very surprised. I loved it.
There's a lot of light in his work. And the light, just because it might be of a kind of a lower tonal range or whatever you want to call it, there's always light emanating from Roger's work. This thing comes out, which is what you hope for in a painting. Not just that it's colourful, but, colour makes light in painting. Sorry, that sounds off, but I'm trying not to say that. But this is it, and this is a great lesson to learn from. You can think of Goya, the blacks in Goya, and Manet and Velasquez. There's always a luminosity. Let's call it luminosity and a light and shining forth. There it is, the title, shining forth.
I can imagine people from all kind of, I was going to say all walks of life, I don't mean that really, but people who perhaps are not familiar with looking at art would still look at this and think, why would someone do that? Why would someone do that over and over and over again? And it's to do with, the repetition and the obsessiveness of it. And I think that fascinates people. Gives it a sort of gravitas. Something very throwaway becomes very significant.
Well, I suppose, his work was so uniquely his own. And, nobody seemed to be doing anything like it anywhere else. And he was sort of like a bit like a monk or something with it. There was all this jollity and playing ping pong, but as regards his work, he was deadly serious and, as I say, a bit like a monk about it. I think he was really quite spiritual, although we never discussed that.
And then spending all this time, I imagine it would take quite a long time. I don't know how long they took to burn these lines, but they look time consuming, and certainly enormous concentration. So I think that's one of the things he did. And this piece of work is made on, well, what is it? I suppose it's probably an offcut that somehow ended up in the sea. And it certainly got pretty bashed. It looks like it's been whacked onto the pebbles, which has worn the surfaces a lot. And then somehow there's quite a large amount of tar in the left bottom hand corner and 2 pebbles embedded in it. So he's kind of worked around that. And the tar, of course, is a very similar colour to the burnt lines. So I think there's a little bit of humour, isn't there, in all this? You know, when he used elastic bands, and you kind of think, elastic bands? How long are they going to last? And map pins and things. You know, I definitely think there's fun in his work, which isn't to say it isn't deeply serious. It is deeply serious, but I think there's fun and play as well. And I think he was like that, wasn't he too? He was like that. But I think that's, yeah, I do think that's quite important, because when you've been working for decades, it's quite easy to lose the playfulness, actually, and the fun. So I think there's an element of that in it as well, of kind of picking up something that most people would think is complete rubbish and making it into a work of art.
Yeah, but that's the essence of his work, isn't it? That you, out of something which was full of insignificant moments and stuff that we haven't seen picked up on, but he'd pick up on something that was really minor and not so, and he'd give it significance. He'd make it into something extraordinary. I've said it now a few different ways, but that's really what Ackling did. I mean, how he did it is kind of always been to some extent, because of my relation, more or less irrelevant for me sometimes. I don't care what he did. It sounds brutal and hard, but I mean, it's not what I'm saying, that I don't care. I'm just saying it's not what's important for me. I mean, it's other things about him that were really, really important.
I think the significance, and humble is maybe not quite the modesty that he would bring to it. Again, you know, I loathe the art world, the art market, you know. The modesty that he, not that he wasn't part of the art market in a way, it was a lot of the work obviously becomes a commodity, and you sell something, you can make more work. But there is a sort of humbleness, a modesty that you bring to it, that you're not bigger than anything else in the world. And that comes out, you know, talking about things coming out of the work, and an encounter with those pieces of work. And you think, how many times can you burn different bits of wood? You know, how many times can you do that? But they all look different. They don't all look the same. They're like human beings. They're all different. Each one, they've got, you know, a kind of connection, genetics, or whatever you want to call it. But they're all absolutely different. And they have modest isn't the right word, and I'm sorry, I'm struggling, but an encounter with something like, you know, a painting, you know, one of Roger's pieces. You just engaged with it, and I said this about a Hughes painting once, but you sort of know what it is to be human. It reminds you what it is to be human.
Oh yes, it's transformative. That he is awakening. That object has had a life, and I think this is one thing he might have self-criticised about, that he was now moving it through his will, because he was very disciplined with his will forces, which a lot of artists aren't. But that it was a vehicle for this way of working, and he could live in the world by doing this practice, which was very simple. He didn't have to do it all the time. It gave him a lot of time for life, and also was extremely economical. That was one of the things I've always admired, because one of my very early tenets was to make things that don't cost, make sculpture out of what does not cost anything. So that means it has to be given in some way, is that nobody else wanted it, and nobody else is going to object if I took it.
It isn't minimalist because it's so organic. And it isn't minimalist because, I was going to say the human touch is so important, which is funny because those lines aren't made actually by human touch, but they have that sort of wavering, quivering, slight uncertainty feels very much like human touch, even if it's I suppose it's to do with the very slight tremor of the hand. which to me communicates, I think it's very poetic, but it's also very much to do with humanity. And I think those are the kind of things that I feel a very strong affinity to.
When I make a sculpture and I burn it, and it's all black, it's now become a very different experience, because it's no longer a wood experience, it's a carbon experience. And it takes on a very different emotional feel. It also feels more distant, where wood is a very friendly material. Every civilization has used wood in a benign way, in building, and mainly heating and cooking. You know, that's the main use of it. And then there are the pieces of wood that can make a stool and a ladder and a shelter and all the other things, and furniture, and because we're borrowing it out of the cycle of coming and going.
And I think that's where the sort of significance for me is in his work. He's really thinking about that, and as a sort of an embodied activity of being still, and an embodied activity of dwelling in a particular place, how that might resonate change.
Yeah, I think the work, you know, for me has sort of still a great deal of kind of conceptual sort of surprise, you know, about how it deals with sort of, you know, time, space, location, encounter, you know, all those kind of things. And each object that Roger produced seems to kind of push that further, even though I could always identify a Roger Ackling work. Every single one seems to kind of be very, very different and surprising in its kind of form and structure, and, you know, the way like it can go completely around, you know. So I think the work still stands up, you know, it's still really, really interesting. I mean, I've introduced, even when I was in Hong Kong teaching, I would introduce, you know, new students to Roger's work, you know, and they would really be surprised by it. And, you know, and I remember maybe, you know, artists that have kind of, I mean, Alan Charlton, you know, Richard Long, Roger Ackling, you know, I think those artists obviously have sort of, their work has stood the test of time. Hamish, Fulton, I mean, so I'm not sort of criticising all the great things that they've done, but I think Roger's, for me, still has so many surprises in it, you know. I still get excited when I see a Roger Ackling work.
I guess these days people talk about art a lot more, and they seem to be very preoccupied with the ideas behind it, and that's great, you know, that's fine. But actually, for me, it's about a habitual, repetitive, consistent work. It's about the work of making, rather than, and it's in a sense, it's sort of I sometimes think of it as a kind of a Jekyll and Hyde kind of approach, where when you're actually making the work, you are engrossed in the doing, and I almost don't think about anything, you know, other than the kind of means ends related activity of, you know, I want to achieve this result or not mess this up, or I want to get this colour or whatever it might be. It's quite simple stuff, but I don't think about it in a macro sense at all in the moment. And then I'll stop, stand back and think, okay, well, what happened here? You know, then it's a completely different kind of thinking. Then it's a much more sort of conceptual, you know, why is that better than that? What am I trying to achieve with this? What does that say? And so it's two quite different sort of ways of doing things. But most of the time, you're doing something which is almost completely mindless.
Yeah, so this work was made on the 22nd of the 5th, 10. This is the day that I got married on, and this was a gift that Roger gave to us, to me and Daniela. It was made between 4 and 5 o'clock, which was the hour that we got married. We got married on a Saturday, and and then Roger gave me this on the Monday. So it's the hour. This is and I think things like that, actually, my initial sort of registration with Roger's work was not really about, when I look at this, I look at the sort of time, if you like, sealed or contained in this moment of making. I don't think I thought about that, actually, at the time when I first understood, or knew what Roger had made. So I think the thing that I've realised with Roger's work and maybe with his teaching is that it really unfolds over time, and I have a very different relationship to it now than what I did, when I was 18, 19. So it shifts and changes, really, even though it ostensibly stayed the same. My relationship to it has altered.
This work was a gift from Roger Ackling. My good friend Roger Ackling gave me this as a gift on my 60th birthday. It's written on the back with Roger's stamp. And so what we have is 60 lines for 60 years. So I just think, you can't argue with that. It's just, it's perfect. So a really nice piece of wood, beautifully made lines, absolutely incredible. So you have all the things like the grains going this way and the lines are going, but anyway, there's all that kind of stuff. But it's just, because also this is a sort of diagram of 60 years, but also that will have taken him quite some time to do all of that, and he did it perfectly.
Oh, this is a beautiful little piece of work that we have at home. One of many pieces of work, but this piece we don't hang on the wall. It's a piece for holding, partly because it's worked on the back and sides, and it's small. It can perfectly fit in my hand, and I like to think about Roger when he held it in his hand, looking at it, working out how he would make it. It's an uneven piece of wood, weathered, so it's probably a piece of driftwood. It's got a V, which means it was made at Volley in 2010. And he's left a little area in the middle that is kind of rough and indented, that he worked around. It's an unusual piece for him to make. Normally he would level things off, but I just think he was thinking about the natural quality of the wood. It doesn't have a straight side, it curves backwards, so he curves his lines round the back, but on that one he just neatly works them round to just the inside edge. I think it's a beautiful, humble thing.
The idea of being an artist without banging a drum about it. The sheer joy of being a human being. I think the great thing about the work is it's human. It's absolutely human. And if you're ever in a space, you're fortunate enough to be in a space with the work, it's always got a presence. And it's a presence like, it's like the presence of the man himself. There was a presence. I've never known anybody else quite like him. I've never really experienced work quite like his. Utterly unique. And I think one's got to celebrate that. And it's important that that kind of idea is promoted. And I think it's fantastic that this exhibition is going to happen. So more people see it.
I met him, I expect, on my first days teaching at Wimbledon Art School in the 80s. Colin Cena was head of painting, And he was like this little sprite hopping about. He was never still. He was always on the move, and he was very sort of tiny and very skinny. And when I painted him, that's why I made his parrot so enormous, to draw attention to how tiny and skinny he was. And a lot of the time he was watching football or the television while I was painting him. And the thing really about Roger was this rather overworked word, integrity. He had an enormous amount of integrity. I mean, he was very, very serious about his work and committed, I mean, as we all are. And he was just, I would say, full of integrity.
He would allude to things. He never gave any specific information about stuff. And he never really, for a very long time, let on about what his interests were, or even what he did. You know, there was no... so he just let people get on with it, you know. And he could even be quite superficial, just pass the time, watch what people were doing. There wasn't really much. I don't think a pedagogic plan there, not at all. So he just, you know, let people get on with it. And I personally went through kind of doubt. Is this at all the right place for me? I mean, what am I? And my very first thing I studied, I just bought, on the way to the school one day, bought balls of string, and I just started just tying knots in string. And I just started tying loads of lots and lots, and the people started very constructive. And I think the first 3 weeks I spent just developing a pile of knotted string. And but I mean, it sounds, I wasn't trying to be clever, I just didn't know what to do with my time, and it seemed to be worthwhile just to do something with my hands. So that was it.
Well, in terms of the material, I suppose it seemed alternative material to what would be thought of as artist materials. So that certainly, you could, I mean, there were other artists around, you know, there was examples, but, you know, it did seem, and I felt very much when we worked together at Wimbledon, they were, you know, especially the students who were involved with performance, and how we would champion some very, very small moments, you know, slight moments a student might be engaging with, and everybody else was sort of looking around, wondering what's going on, and he would totally engage with it. But the making, of course, is so so important in his work as well. So I think both of those things, you know, the making and his attitude to making, his choice of materials, his process, the development of his process was very singular, was an absolute great example. So I don't really separate that, the importance of those things.
Yes, I mean, one of the things that we did on a regular basis, there were assessments where there would be a number of staff together, and Roger and I often did that together, and we talked to a student about their work, and we would each try and get something from the student that made, you know, a reaction, a desire, a problem. You know, we were trying in our own way to make that studentship hopefully as good as it could be, you know, and get, but at the same time make it challenging. So there was this balance between yes, things look good, you know, this is interest, you know, but there's, and were that, you know, the reservations that a student might have. I mean, you've got somebody at that time who was probably coming in Some students in their first year would only be 18, 19. And they're still young, beautifully young, wonderfully young. And I think that was another thing that was of terrific interest to Roger, that, I mean, he was interested in play, he was interested in not losing his, it's not childishness, but his youth, his pleasure, his enjoyment in something. You know, games were important. Not taking things too seriously when they shouldn't be, but taking them very seriously when they should be.
Well, you know, there were the proper days of art school where lots of visiting artists went in all the time, you know, unlike nowadays when they have to cough up all this money and if they're lucky they see someone for a tutorial or something once a week, which is absolutely obscene. I mean, when I was an art student in the 60s, we had lots of different visiting artists every day, and we had grants and everything was as it should be. So I don't know how many days a week he did, but we just instantly became friends. And we were the champions of the ping pong. It's very important. Nobody could beat Roger Ackling and me at ping pong.
I think what struck me about all our conversations was his energy, his enthusiasm, his sense of listening and wanting to create affinity with what you were doing, and that if this process was going on, then it was real and it was about art, not about him or you. And that, for me, instantly felt like a really brilliant model for teaching. What's difficult in a way is to distinguish absolutely the experience of Roger as a tutor from the experience much later in my career of working with him as a fellow tutor with other students, because in a way the two things did for me seeg into each other, despite the fact that there was a gap of more than 15 years between the first and the second.
Well, I remember he sort of always struck me as someone who was so fundamentally part of the success of Chelsea Art School at that time, developing this whole new kind of studio. But he had a very healthy sort of distance from the institutional politics, so he would come in and go out in that sort of way. And I sort of, you know, although I can't remember specific things, I think he had a healthy sort of critique of the institution and certain people in that institution. And obviously we were going to be, well, Chelsea at that time was just about to be kind of amalgamated into the London Institute, and so there was quite a lot of like talk about that. And I think he, you know, he seemed to me as somebody who was sort of, you know, yeah, like in and out institutionally in a kind of interesting way.
So important to the institution without being institutionalised.
Yes, and he'd set up within that his own institution, which was the kind of Roger Ackling School of Art, which was on the 4th floor of Chelsea, where, you know, they either put people that they didn't know what to do with, or Roger knew exactly what he was doing with Trevor, and, you know, and they were creating a kind of alternative, you know, art school.
And then Roger was a strange floating figure. I know that hadn't always been the case, but at that point he was neither 3rd floor or 4th floor, he was neither X-way, he was sort of just this one who seemed to have found a way to occupy space, I suppose, in a way which seemed productive, but at the same time extremely obstructive.
And then I had Roger as my tutor. We used to change tutor every term. But I had Roger for my first term, which is not to say that I didn't speak to him after that. You know, we spoke pretty regularly actually over the 3 years, and he was my tutor in my final year. But the painting course then was split into 2 floors, a 3rd floor and a 4th floor. So the 3rd floor was was really where if you were a painter, figurative or you know, sort of loose abstraction, let's call it that, you would have been there. And you had an entirely different group of staff than if you were on the 4th floor. So I was on the 4th floor being a non-painter. And I had Roger, and I think we didn't get appointments in the way that you perhaps get an appointment now. There was not a timetable. So the time, if there was a timetable, it was just that you were there 9 till 5, and we had an art history lecture once a week for an hour. I think we had to write an essay once a term, and I just seem to remember Roger coming to see me for tutorials, and they seemed to last for at least an hour, but maybe sometimes longer. Only one-on-one, and I can't remember any group discussion ever. We never had any sort of group crits or anything like that. And we were also mixed in year groups. So I was in a space on the 4th floor with, I think, only third years. So there was only me as a first year, and I was in a space with other third years. And one of the things that was good about that was I could, although when Roger spoke to you, it was often quite sort of close. So he would sit, you'd be sat quite close to each other, and sometimes it was quite quiet. So it was really meant for you. It wasn't meant for anybody else. But I used to try and listen to everybody else's tutorials too.
Well, I think the word provocative it is the key word, but it also maybe let's take the focus away from what it's meant to be, i.e., the work of art or the aspiring work of art, but let's talk about how it's come into the world in a different way, what it's surrounded by. Can we talk about it without talking about it? And then eventually get him round to actually saying something about the work itself, if it needs it, or if it seemed appropriate. But it was. I felt that what it did, it enabled people to be very aspiring and honest, and it wasn't just that I'm learning something, I'm finding something out about myself. And it doesn't really matter at the end of the day if everybody else in the room thinks this is not particularly interesting or good. But if I've got a relationship with it, there's something to go with.
The majority of people on the MA course, the teachers who came in part-time, were very concerned with the concepts and the ideas behind the students' work and wished to move or change or whatever, develop those things, whereas Roger was very, very different. He would usually take a student right back to very simple things about, I don't know, if you're working on paper, why are you selecting that sort of paper? Why that size? Why those paints? He would go through every little stage of their work and say, is there any way that you can improve it? And he was very much that sort of person that wanted to go through every stage, and his thoughts are always that a student should, or anybody should, make the best possible decisions and best possible work at every stage, because work you can drop into various stages.
Definitely in my own case, what Roger gave me was a lot of good guidance about survival and hanging in there. He'd been there, he'd done his gardening and things like that while he carried on making work after he left college. So when I left Chelsea, I ended up riding a bike as a courier for 3 years. And I think Roger could see that I was up for the fight. I didn't want to go back to the Midlands where I'd grown up. I knew if I wanted to be an artist, somehow I needed to hang on in London. And he could see I had a lot of energy, and Roger really liked people and talked a lot about energy. He valued it as as the sort of lingua franca that you need to make work. If you haven't got a lot of energy for it, you're going to fall away.
So I seem to remember the conversations were just about what I'd made, but they weren't. It's difficult to say. I don't think they were about process necessarily, or explicitly about process, and they certainly weren't about materials explicitly. They were almost at a real tangent, or it felt, to maybe what you make. So there was none of the sort of what I would call sort of lazy art tutor advice about, you know, I think the work's a bit small, it could do with being a bit bigger. It wasn't that sort of discussion, and there was no sort of aesthetic, you know, I mean, I didn't use colour anyway, but there was none of that sort of discussion about perhaps, you know, there's not enough green, or and I can't actually remember any discussions about looking at other artists, really. There was no recommendations of, you know, you should look at, have you ever thought of looking at, you know, which I always think, you know, because I teach now myself, that's quite lazy teaching in a way, but there was never any of that. I can't remember any references or referrals to look at a book, or to go and look at you know, read a novel or things like this. It was really just about the situation of being there with the work and looking at it, and Roger responding to it, and perhaps talking quite tangentially about it made him think of, and it might be a sort of anecdote or a story about something.
There were things he said that remain in my head, and I have done this all this time. Fall down, stand up. About not blotting your copybook. It wasn't a question of knowing oneself, but revealing oneself.
What do you think he meant by not blotting one's copybook?
I think that's something quite tricksy and mischievous, which there was always a sort of underlying element of that, I felt. There was something sort of, there was a huge generosity, and then a sort of inscrutability about what I felt, how I responded to his work and to our conversations.
Did he address your work in material form? In terms of, was his interest in often about materials or about your approach to making?
There was some discussion about materials, but probably more to do with approaches to things and just more general discussion and throwing in sort of tangential questions.
Roger was, well, he was just so charismatic, actually. He was an extraordinary character to be alongside when you're having those kind of conversations, and very gentle. And the way he would, I mean, I learned a great deal. I'd like to think I learned from him as well. But you know, the way he brought things out of people, but you know, the way he would build up a sort of rapport and momentum to get to this, maybe to actually say or enlighten the student to the thing he really wanted them to say. So there's this kind of wonderful journey along the way. And he listened. That was a great thing about Roger and what I learned from him. And other people, actually. But Roger listened. You always felt, even when you were talking, it wasn't that he was just being silent. He was actually listening. And I think for a very young artist, that's an important thing. And I know that from when he would visit, and when I'd moved on to the Slade and he would come in occasional days, I know the feedback, if you like, horrible word actually, feedback from the students was, you know, they felt they'd had this most amazing encounter with this person, a bit like a guru or something.
When Roger was teaching, I felt that he was quite evangelical in the way that he taught, with a small e. He had a sense of faith, he had a sense of spirituality, he was a lover of life, of living things, he was a lover of nature. And he wanted to express those things. He wanted to pass those loves on to students. It was quite important for him to do that. And some students were more receptive to that than others. So even after they finished their educational courses, he kept in touch. They shared things. They shared things that he loved. They were great admirers of his work.
So if I thought Roger wouldn't have liked the show at all upstairs, I would be, well, it wouldn't be up there. I just wouldn't, I wouldn't, you know, that's part of who I am, that. Because, I mean, one of the things I've often felt over a period of time, especially perhaps making photographs in a way, is that the idea that you're this individual making work in some kind of cerebral isolation, I think, is the great illusion of art. Because you know, who I am, what I make, and all the things that have come to bear on it have come out of a whole sequence of relationships, especially working with other artists as much as I did. And you know, although I apparently didn't have much of a relationship as a student with Roger, he was absolutely integral to who I ended up with, who I ended up being as an artist. So, yeah, it's. I guess that says it, doesn't it, Ren?
Completely. There's a sort of role model element, and I suppose the key also to that generosity is within it the sense of the need to disrupt, the mischief maker, the refusal to be hierarchical, and actually the active need at certain points that Roger had to sort of just nudge, you know, hierarchical positions out of their comfort zone. So that was based on a sort of real drive, I think, to make attentiveness the primary objective in what we're doing, and not to settle for hierarchical positions. And it also included at times almost bloody-minded refusal to agree to certain constraints being put on the education system. And as the education system through the 90s and noughties got more and more market-led, market-driven, marketized, Roger's ability to kind of step through that was kind of legendary, because I think a lot of people admired it, but they didn't have the confidence to do that themselves.
I think this is the way in which I've been most influenced by Roger. Well, it's difficult to say, isn't it? But the way in which he put his work together. I mean, I've never felt with my work that one piece was differentiated from another. It seems almost entirely arbitrary that, you know, the work I'm doing at the moment, I put in frames, but you know, that moment where you put it in a frame, you know, it's obviously kind of that piece and that piece are two separate pieces, but actually it's all part of the same continuum, and it seems almost entirely arbitrary where you draw the line and say, well, you know, that bit there is one piece of work and that bit there is another piece of work. And this is very evident with the way Roger installed his work. And I think one of the things that I found most sort of fascinating about the way watching, you know, putting an exhibition on and watching him install his work is the way in which the nature of the work, its physicality, is to some extent determines its installation. But then there's a whole load of other things that do too. So, for example, the space that it's in, the architecture of the space, the light, the way in which people might interact with or encounter that space. You know, where's the entrance and exit? You know, all of these things become the material the determinants by which he would put an installation together.
But then so much work would then be needed to sort of, group those things together in a space. I mean, for me, it was the power of the individual works themselves, but also the impact of having those works presented in a kind of, like a cosmos of work, where they relate and talk to each other. I think that's, for me, very, very memorable and interesting. And I haven't seen one of those shows for a long time. So I think it'd be really good to see that now, to see a Roger Ackling show now.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's where that combination of pragmatism, flatter the space, and actually the reason for it not being, a narcissist or, constantly needing to be the centre of attention, but thinking of the space and how you get the best out of it for everybody's benefit, not just your own. So, in a way, that worked on two levels. One, it was in installing work in a space, whether his own or other people's, an absolute sensitivity to how the placing of that work affected its meaning. So, a sort of architectural, attuned nature, also the way, for example, a really skilled landscape gardener will understand how plantings unfold over time. So I think at the heart of his work in that level, there's a really heightened spatial awareness, and I think that's part of what he taught people through installing work.
There were quite a number of pieces hung, I think, as my memory remembers, was hung at a similar sort of height all the way around the gallery space. And yeah, this presence, but inscrutability as well. And there was a not knowing quite what to make of it.
And I remember I had an exhibition at a gallery called Dick Smith in 2008. Roger came to it, and he said because I remember thinking I'd been quite how would I put it? What would be the phrase? Not very traditional in my installation. I'd been quite quite out there, I thought, for my installation. Roger didn't think so. He said he thought there was a better exhibition within the exhibition that I'd made, and it made me really think. I'd not really thought about it, although staff for me not to think about it, because every exhibition I saw of Roger's was really, because I think Roger's work is always sort of understood about that activity of burning driftwood with a magnifying glass, but actually it was also about the making of the show. So when I think back about the shows that I saw of Roger's, they were always dramatically different. They were really extraordinarily different.
There's one thing, when we talk about installations, or installing work, I guess this was my first experience of installing an exhibition with Roger. And at the time I was making these kind of terribly sort of muscular, masculine kind of things, great big heavy things with structures made out of aluminium. And I would kind of, I'd turn up to this show that we mentioned, Definite Article, with a great big sort of building site box full of power tools and so on, because I was going to cut holes in walls and things like that. And then Roger turned up with a little drawstring bag, like those bags that you had when you were a kid with your PE pumps in. So he had one of those, and in this bag was a little handheld drill, some blue tack, some push pins, a little ruler, and that was about it. So I turned up with this, feeling, like a very masculine, sort of muscular artist, with my great big sight box full of power tools, and he turned up with this. It was almost slightly camp, but he didn't need anything other than that. He just, and then he went on to produce this wonderful installation with just the contents of this little drawstring bag.
Well, the simple things sometimes, like we might be in a tutorial situation with a student, and this continued when eventually we were both teaching at Chelsea. But I remember hearing, probably for the first time, the idea that a piece of work could exist without, one seeing it. So the work could be placed in a box or a cupboard or somewhere obscure, or it would be very high on the wall or very low on the wall. It was all about challenging conventions, I suppose.
I remember once he came to Wiverton Parish Rooms, and it was a meeting to do with the North Norfolk exhibition project. It was kind of like a meeting before the exhibition. He had work in it, he had got a lot of work in it. And he arrived at this meeting with a rubbish bag, a black refuse bag. And we'd all taken work. Most of us had, really made an effort with the old bubble wrap and the snazzy boxes. But Roger turned up with this black bag, and out of the black bag he produced this orange box that he'd been working on. And that was one of the supports he used. He'd made a series of works on these discarded orange boxes. So I think one of the things he really liked was to take something that was, I was going to say rubbish, something that was discarded and something that had had a former life and something that had really kind of been bashed and abused.
So within our core collection there are a lot of Nicholson and Hepworth works. They're really the core. And the circle, both as a kind of hollowed out thing through small Hepworth sculpture like Two Forms Orkney, or in many of our prints, or in Nicholson's 5 circles, or 3 circles. The circle plays a kind of key part, and then light's a key factor in describing colour, and it's very particular. It's very particular in our building as well, because we often, we've small windows facing the sea, and you get that kind of reflection of the sea back into the building on the ceilings. And there's a very particular light because there's so much sea all around. It's an island. And I think it was one of the things that Margaret Gardner, who founded the gallery and donated the collection to Orkney, was recognising that was similar about the St Ives experience. It's a Neolithic landscape. It's surrounded by 3 seas, Atlantic, the English Sea, English Channel, the Irish Sea, whereas here we've got the Pentland Firth and the Atlantic and the North Sea, and lots of Neolithic remains. Circles, stone circles, circles carved out of stones, all of those things, and the resonance between Hepworth's work, Nicholson's work, the landscape, made that connections. In relation to Roger's work, while they're linear, they're in fact all small circles, burnt images of the sun, if you will, making up a line. And that seemed to be, a kind of profound thing, because we had based a lot of our collecting around that kind of notion that light and circles were a key element of the abstraction that we were seeing and colour were a key element. Colours maybe doesn't necessarily appear overtly in Roger's work. It kind of enters it more latterly in his work, but it's undoubtedly, looking closely at those works, you see that each line is in fact lots and lots of small circles. And they're beautiful because they are in fact images of the sun, and that's in itself kind of fascinating.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. So another thing that that I did for him was so he knew I was a cyclist. So then one day I wasn't much in touch with him, but out of the blue he said, "Richard, I'm doing a lecture at the Royal Academy. I'd like you to come up from Bristol with your bicycle and cycle around the audience while I'm doing this talk." And so I said, right. I knew nothing about what it was about. So I came up and I cycled from Paddington into the Royal Academy and went up in the lift and found it was the Joshua Reynolds room, and there was just enough space between the paintings and the edges of the chairs, and it was dark, and Roger was giving a slideshow, and it was about Alfred Jarry. That was one of his favourite heroes. And just out of the corner of my eye, I could see that the slideshow that he was giving was some photographs of flowers upside down. But my main duty was to concentrate and just cycle around the audience. And I had to, because it was dark, so I had my front light on.
Without hitting the walls?
Yeah. All the. So I don't know, I must have circled around like 10 times or something. And then I thought that was enough. And then I stopped, cycled, and then took my bike out of the door, went down the lift and cycled back to Paddington and back to Bristol. Thought nothing more of it. And then, like about a month later, I happened to run into Roger in Piccadilly somewhere. And he said, "Oh, Rich, thanks for, that was great, coming up." He said that the one legacy of that, my little thing, was that like the next day, there was a sign on the lift saying that bicycles are not allowed in the lift.